It's on? Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Professor Pete Moore, and we are very honored here today to have Professor Brownlee from the University of Texas. Professor Brownlee has worked quite extensively on the Middle East and on the issue of authoritarianism. He earned his PhD from Princeton. He was a fellow at Stanford before taking his current position at the University of Texas, Austin. His book, Authoritarianism in the Age of Democratization, addressed the case of Egypt along with several others. He's quite prolific in journal publication in the field of political science and specifically Middle East politics. So we plan to have him here before the events of the last month and a half in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt. So we're quite fortunate to have him here today, and he's going to be speaking on the issue of American-Egyptian relations and the ramifications for domestic Egyptian politics. So I'd like to thank Professor Brownlee and give him a warm welcome.
Everything's on. Okay, we're on, right? I'm going to start with, I guess, the sense that most of you have an idea of what's been happening in Egypt. And so January 25th, a popular revolution began. February 11th, Hosni Mubarak, who had been president since October of 1981, resigned. It was a major victory for Egyptians who had opposed him for a long time, but previously been unable to push through meaningful political reform. And for those of us who study authoritarianism, it was a real pleasant surprise, because in the few seconds that Vice President Omar Suleiman went on television February 11th and announced that Hosni Mubarak was resigning, Egypt flipped from being a testament to durable authoritarianism to being an exemplar of popular mobilization and nonviolent resistance. And I think what we're watching right now is the largest democratic experiment in the Middle East. And we're still watching it unfold, but there is great potential that we will look back on January 25th as the day in which Egypt began to move to be something like the India of the Middle East, a country that is a role model for nonviolent progress toward democracy and a major leader in its own region for that reason. So what I'm going to focus on today is the question of why this happened now, why Mubarak lost power because of the January 25th revolution in 2011. And it seems like so far there are the main explanation that has circulated emphasizes widespread poverty. We know that poverty in Egypt is about 40%, people living on less than $2 a day. It's 40% of some 80 million people, so that's 32 million people or so. High unemployment, especially among youth, and including educated youth. And then also, so those kind of very combustible conditions combining with internet activism, some very innovative organizing online through Facebook and other social networking media. So those are kind of the big variables that we have right now about explaining why the January 25th revolution was successful. But we should not, we really shouldn't be satisfied with that as an explanation, because many of these factors have been present for some time. There has been discontent with neoliberal economic reform in Egypt for decades. And as I'll elaborate in a moment, it really began in 1977, which raises the question, okay, why was it unsuccessful in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s? In addition, young Egyptians have been discontent and dissatisfied with the Mubarak regime for a long time, and they have many ways of expressing their dissatisfaction besides taking to the streets and protesting. They can, if they have the skills and the background, they can go to the Gulf and get a job there. If they're not as fortunate and they still just want to leave, they can get on a fishing boat and try to make it to southern Europe, as thousands attempted during the early 2000s. Many perished, actually, because the boats were not seaworthy or they were overburdened. So for years we've had young Egyptians basically exiting from the country rather than contesting it. So it raises the question, why was there the attitudinal shift? And then finally, with regard to internet activism, which is obviously a more recent phenomenon than general socioeconomic grievances, for years there have been tens of thousands of people signing up on Facebook as friends of Mohammed al-Baradei or the April 6th movement, other opposition groups. Tens of thousands online, sometimes only dozens in the streets. So we have a major question of why the internet activism actually translated into a street presence. Now, so those are kind of the components of the nascent conventional wisdom and reasons why we should question them. Prior to that, of course, sort of prior to January 25th, the main argument we had about Egypt was it's durable authoritarian, it's not going to change, the opposition is sort of pathologically divided and fragmented, they're not going to get their act together. And what I'm going to sort of outline today is I think there are actually useful elements of both narratives, both this new techno-economic determinism and then the old regime path dependence. And the regime path dependence is useful for, it's instructive for us because there was a sense of overconfidence among both Egyptian leaders and U.S. officials, backed up by the scholarly literature, a sense of overconfidence that the political system in Egypt was not under threat. And this was a change from decades of vigilance when U.S. officials and Egyptian leaders were concerned about a repeat of the riots that occurred in 77, or even more catastrophically, a repeat of the 79 revolution in Iran. So that was kind of the nightmare scenario for a long time. But by around the year 2000, that had faded away. And there was a sense that Mubarak was more or less invulnerable, that the opposition was not serious, and that attitude from elites in Washington and Cairo continued up through January 25th. I mean, actually, even January 25th, we have Hillary Clinton saying, we believe Egypt is stable. So that's kind of like the last, the culmination of that argument or that assumption. And this is going on while there were labor protests kind of popping up around the country in 2008 and other years in the first decade of the century. And while there were some grassroots movements. But the basic expectation was these are not going to coalesce into anything serious. And while it led to kind of, I guess I'd say sort of apathy on the part of U.S. officials, except for a small group within the George W. Bush administration that I can talk about if there's interest. But basically apathy, expectations of stability were what pervaded Washington's thinking. For those in Cairo, the ruling elites, especially those in the National Democratic Party, increasingly led by Hosni Mubarak's son Gamal, this kind of apathy and complacency eventually turned into public displays of contempt for the opposition and contempt for Egyptian citizens in general, such that when horrific police brutality occurred in June of 2010, there was no high-level accountability, there was no serious response from the government for a real meaningful investigation. And later that year, when the opposition decided the elections were so fraudulent they wouldn't even participate in the second half of them, the president simply dismissed them and said, kind of like as if they were kids, and said, let them amuse themselves. So you had a regime that was minimizing police brutality and infantilizing its political opponents. So what makes the difference then? When you have this kind of apathy? A big component of the declining socioeconomic situation in Egypt over the past few years has been the absence of any concerted effort by Washington and Cairo to provide meaningful economic relief. In the past, the U.S. has intervened, the U.S. and also IMF and international donors have intervened with timely economic bailouts to prevent widespread socioeconomic unrest. But once they started thinking about Egypt as basically a durable authoritarian regime, those did not seem to be necessary. So I think in hindsight we can see that Egypt was due, desperately needed some type of major economic rescue package over the past few years and didn't get it. Okay, but sort of apathy and widespread economic discontent alone wasn't going to do it. What happened that really made a difference over really the past few years is that these cyber activists who in 2010 got a kind of guardian figure when Mohamed El-Baradei, former chief of the IAEA, Nobel Prize winner, Mohamed El-Baradei returns to Egypt in 2010, and he launches kind of a quasi-presidential candidacy. And the attention gets placed on him, and he provides a sort of umbrella of publicity and international attention for the activists who were previously operating more or less in the political wilderness and were quite vulnerable to repression. So under his aegis, these activists are able to really work on priming the public for making a serious challenge against the regime. That whole campaign receives a massive boost on January 14th of this year when a popular revolt in Tunisia ousted the President Zine Adine Ben Ali from that country. And when Tunisians ejected their kind of strongman dictator, they basically shattered the deterrent capacity of the Egyptian Ministry of Interior. They showed, we can do it, Egyptians can do it. And they showed the power of popular protest. So then these internet organizers really get a second wind, and they become, I would say, given their generally affluent background, they became the gilded linchpin of a national movement that was previously disparate and ineffective. And this movement drives Mubarak out, and it launches this amazing democratic experiment. Now, what follows will depend on whether and to what extent they're able to continue to bridge the disparate dreams and hopes of those who had opposed Mubarak the dreams and hopes which they had focused together so powerfully. So before going any further, let me just recap in very simple terms the moving parts of the argument I'm laying out. So we have, on one side in Egypt, really bad socioeconomic situation, mass discontent. But that's been going on for decades, even though recently it's been getting much, much worse. Doesn't explain January 2011 because the condition has been there the whole time. On the other, we have elite apathy among officials in Washington and Cairo that eventually let their guard down, and they don't tend to the socioeconomic problems that they previously addressed. And then in the middle, we have these internet activists, which bring together and focus the labor movements, the working class unrest, into a potent movement in January. So in the rest of my time, what I want to do is lay out the background to how prior protests have taken place, and then kind of very recent background that made such a difference. So there's another January. I've already referred to it once or twice. There's another January to keep in mind when we talk about January 25th. The other January is January 18th through 19th, the price riots in Egypt, which were the largest national moment of collective contentious action until 2011. Anwar Sadat had, President Anwar Sadat came into power in 1970. He succeeded Gamal Abdel Nasser. And for the better part of the decade, he had been trying to jumpstart a post-war economic and infrastructural recovery for Egypt. By 1977, it was clear that his attempts with economic reform and also trying to seek Western support and Gulf investment were not paying off sufficiently to get his government operating in the black. So he needed to cut back on public subsidies, which were payouts to help working-class Egyptians afford things like cooking oil and sugar. In January, the subsidies are announced, and in response, Egyptians all across the country take to the streets. The riots last for 2 days, and eventually Sadat deploys the military. But they only agree to go into the streets on condition that the subsidies will be reinstated. So Sadat does that, the military is put into the streets, and the riots are quelled. About 80 people die, and thousands are detained. That was a moment, this is before the Iranian Revolution. The price riots of 77 became a cautionary tale for international economists, for not just Egypt, but countries all around the world. This notion that if you push domestic reforms that are too draconian, you will get a political backlash, which will derail them and also potentially threaten the government in question. So essentially, U.S. and Egyptian policy since '77 has sought to prevent a repeat of that moment. In 1986, there is another major moment of upheaval, not as large as the price riots, but still quite significant. But what is interesting to note about all of the episodes of major collective action that I'm going to describe subsequent to '77 is that they did not have the same kind of national cohesion and national participation. They were more isolated. And so there's a moment in '86 I'm going to describe, in 1992, and then in 2008, none of which got the same level of national participation as '77. So in '86, the police riot in Cairo. They're known as the Central Security Forces. They today number in about 300,000, and they are staffed by Egyptians that are considered too poorly educated to go into the conventional armed forces for their military service. And the conscripts that go into these riot police are known to have atrocious living conditions, like 2 meals a day, hardly being paid anything, very menial tasks. And what happens in '86 is that their terms of service, which are supposed to be 3 years, are proposed. It's proposed that they are lengthened to 4 years. They riot in protest, vandalizing and torching luxury hotels and other buildings in Western Cairo. They are also eventually suppressed by the military, like in '77. But what's interesting, especially interesting about '86, is that these conscripts, who were primarily from rural backgrounds, are not joined in their demonstrations by other Cairenes. So the rest of the population, kind of the urban population of Cairo, just stands aside, lets them riot, lets the military suppress them, does not intervene, does not stand in solidarity with them. Another moment in which working class or lower class Egyptians are suppressed without broader popular solidarity is 1992. The shanty town of Imbaba in Cairo rises up. They become a sort of mini Islamic sheikhdom in Imbaba that was enforcing Islamic law for a few years. It was led by a 28-year-old named Sheikh Gabr. And this is a very undeveloped part of Cairo. And it is this Islamic Republic of Imbaba, as they declare it, is also suppressed by the military. Again, without kind of making broader popular resonance. Then in 2008, after a series of labor strikes in the textile town of Mahalla al-Kubra, a group of internet activists organizes the April 6th movement to call for a general strike across the whole country in solidarity with the Mahalla textile workers. They get 64,000 Facebook friends, but the general strike itself fizzles, partly for lack of broader public interest, but also in part because the regime detained some of the leadership of April 6th. At that moment, there was a lot of discussion about the regime crumbling, potentially, because the Mahalla protests involved people filling the streets of the town and tearing down a billboard to Mubarak. So you have that imagery, that kind of imagery of the dictator's visage being ripped off, sort of effaced from public space, but it doesn't catch on. The irony of the April 6th movement is their signature day, their signature protest fizzles out. Now, they continue to organize over subsequent years, and they end up being quite successful, but in 2006, that it did not catch on. Okay, so that's those are the main examples of how mass discontent had not previously translated into concerted political action. Now, in terms of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship and this issue of elite apathy, under Sadat, the U.S. and Egypt forged a partnership, a kind of strategic partnership, in which Egypt would help the U.S. Toward two major goals. The first was preserving the security of Israel, mainly by signing a peace treaty with Israel and then making sure that it was honored. And second, helping the United States to project power to the Persian Gulf. In 1980, Jimmy Carter announced his eponymous doctrine, in which he said that the U.S. would defend the free movement of oil from the Middle East. That immediately raised the question of how the U.S. would, the free movement of oil rather from the Persian Gulf, and it immediately raised the question of how the U.S. would get to the Persian Gulf. In order, just physically and logistically, to move troops or materiel from the Mediterranean to the Gulf, the U.S. needs to either circumlocute Africa or pass through Egyptian airspace and waters. And so Egypt was going to be a crucial node in the network of power projection, and it remains the case that it assists the U.S. in this project. Between 2001 and 2005, Egypt granted the U.S. 20 overflight permissions a day for planes going through Egyptian airspace for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other missions. So this partnership was crucial, and it was vital that for this partnership to continue, that political stability in Egypt be assured. And so the U.S. began in the late 1970s to provide a substantial military aid package to Egypt, second only to what Israel receives. It eventually became $1.3 billion in grants, not loans. And the military aid helped to prevent a coup within Egypt by keeping the military loyal to the president. And it also helped to ensure the peace treaty, to make sure there were no violations of the treaty. Now, in combination with the military aid, there was a smaller program of economic aid, economic support funds, and also food subsidies that were aimed at preventing a repeat of the price riots of 1977. In the mid-1990s, in conjunction with some changes that go on in the U.S.-Israel aid relationship, the U.S. puts economic aid to Egypt on a glide path, basically reducing it by about $50 million a year, so that currently it's whereas it used to be, it began at 800 million in the mid-1990s, it's currently under only 250 million. So gradually economic support is being reduced. At the same time, debt for Egypt was mounting, and the socioeconomic situation in Egypt for the mass of Egyptians was deteriorating. In terms of growth, Egypt posted strong numbers in the late 1990s and also in the late 2000s, whatever we're calling it, the first decade. So around 2008, 2009, the growth numbers were good. And also earlier in the decade, they were around 7%, 6%, ditto for the late 1990s. Great growth numbers, worthy of a positive profile in The Economist, which Egypt sort of regularly received. But they didn't speak to the gap between rich and poor and growing economic impoverishment. As a WikiLeaks cable detailed or discussed in 2008, levels of economic poverty had reached about 35 to 40% at that time. Yet the cable referred to economic reform in Egypt as a success story, saying words to the effect of economic reform. The economic reform program in Egypt has been a success, although the country still suffers from widespread and so far irremediable poverty that affects upwards of 35 to 40% of the population. So this is quite a difference in attitude from the U.S. government that began the aid relationship soon after the 77 price riots, also that forgave Egyptian debt to the U.S. completely after the first Persian Gulf War in 1991. There's a sense by the 2000s that Egypt politically will be able to get along even as these economic pressures mount. And the other side of this from Egyptian officials was a sense of political complacency that sort of eventually bred contempt. And we have evidence of this from the WikiLeaks cables. In 2005, Liz Cheney, daughter of Vice President Dick Cheney, met with Gamal Mubarak to talk about presidential elections in Egypt. Now, Liz Cheney is part of this small group of democracy promotion fans in the George W. Bush administration that for their own interests and for U.S. strategic interests thought it would be a positive thing for Mubarak to engage in serious political reform. And they tried to kind of ratchet up the pressure on him in public and as well as in private meetings. So from the WikiLeaks cable, we know that Cheney and Gamal Mubarak meet to talk about elections that Gamal's father just won with 88% of the vote. And the question that Liz Cheney poses is, okay, yeah, what will the elections be like next time? 88%, that's obviously not a very competitive field, but what about 6 years from then, 2011, what will the elections be like? And the rapporteur for that particular cable records that Gamal responds kind of nonchalantly. He says, it'll just depend on the opposition whether they get their act together. That kind of disregard for the opposition, a sense that the ruling elite are not at all part of the problem, continues over subsequent years as Gamal Mubarak and other members of the ruling party spearhead a series of constitutional amendments that make it more and more likely that the 2011 election will be either a continuation of Hosni Mubarak's rule or a kind of handover from Hosni Mubarak to Gamal Mubarak, legitimated or cloaked in a presidential election. In 2010, the parliamentary elections are horribly rigged, as I've already mentioned, and Hosni Mubarak dismisses the opposition's bid for a kind of parallel parliament. So what we see here on the Egyptian side is a real kind of supreme overconfidence when it comes to the opposition. A sense, not at all a sense of urgency that action needed to be taken to address the underlying sources of socioeconomic content, but rather an idea that really the status quo is sustainable. Eventually, more economic development may occur for large portions of the population, but for the moment, it's okay that Egyptians will sort of make do and they'll get by. There's really one event in 2010 that crystallizes this disregard for the public, this kind of insult to Egyptian dignity coming from the leadership, and that is the murder of Khalid Said, a young businessman, who in June 2010 was working late at night in a cyber cafe in Alexandria when two cops came into the cafe and accosted him and demanded a bribe. He refused to pay them, and they began to physically beat him. Witnesses then described that they removed him from the cyber cafe, took him to a nearby apartment building where they continued to hit him, and in that apartment building he perished of his wounds. He perished from his injuries. After the death of Khalid Said, pictures from both just like a normal headshot of him and pictures from the morgue that showed just how severely he had been pummeled circulated widely on the internet, and a Facebook group sprang up, We Are All Khalid Said, that showed it wasn't just the politically active people who could be vulnerable in Egypt. And of course everyone sort of collectively knew that. I mean, they were all familiar with the capriciousness of Egyptian police. But what the internet and YouTube as well could do is kind of simultaneously give everyone a connection around this one experience that epitomized what many had been going through. And so that's what the We Are All Khalid Said movement did, and it was a backbone of the January 25th movement. Now it's interesting that the incident which catalyzes the revolution in Tunisia is also one involving police brutality. A little different story, but it begins with police accosting a young man, Mohammed Bouazizi, who was selling fruit kind of technically illegally. It was the only way for him to make money, and just doing his own kind of informal fruit stand. And the police demanded a bribe from him. He couldn't pay it. They humiliated him, and then he set himself on fire and died from the wounds in weeks later. And so his self-immolation sparked a series of kind of copycat attempts across North Africa, including in Egypt, which ended with actually right after Ben Ali, the Tunisian dictator, right after Ben Ali leaves Tunisia on January 14th, between January 14th and January 19th, there's something like 7 people in Egypt who try to set themselves on fire. And at this point, the We Are All Khalid Said movement, as well as the April 6th movement, come in. They circulate a video in which a young woman named Asma Mahfouz speaks directly to the camera and says, we're going to go out on January 25th, which is a national holiday that used to celebrate the Egyptian police and the stand they had taken against the British, but which became, for 2011, a moment of commemorating Khalid Said and bringing attention, focusing attention and criticism on police brutality. She says, we're going to go out on January 25th into the streets, and if you are, if you are man enough, she speaks directly to Egyptian men, if you are man enough, you should be out there. Don't say that women shouldn't participate in protests. If you think they're going to be harmed, then come out and help protect us. But I'm going to go out there. I'm not going to set myself on fire 4 people this week have already set themselves on fire. I'm not going to do it. If the security forces want to want to light me on fire, they can do that, but I'm not going to do that to myself. Instead, we're going to turn out and we're going to take a stand. And we're going to push for social justice and an end to this police brutality. And so that video, which goes viral, is crucial for spreading the message about the January 25th movement. But it's not just the internet activists alone. And here we come back to all those people who were from less privileged backgrounds, who were struggling really, in many cases, much longer. Levels of illiteracy in Egypt are estimated to be about 40%. That's illiteracy. And then levels of poverty are also about 40%. So if you think about it, this is a large portion of the population which is not reading Facebook, which is not kind of participating in the cyber organizing, and yet was crucial for the final movement on January 25th, when there was this opportunity. So from the January 25th movement to where we are now, we have Hosni Mubarak resigns on the 11th of February, and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces takes over. And it's interesting that the demonstrators welcomed military rule, at least kind of temporary military rule. Better to have a provisional junta than a permanent kleptocracy. So this was considered a welcome change from Mubarak. And it remains an open question about the extent to which the current cabinet, as well as the government that will come in future elections, will really constitute a full regime change. But I think that the answer to that question will depend upon the ability of the January 25th movement to stay connected with all those people around Egypt, the workers, labor activists, people in the Sinai, people in different corners of the country, to stay connected with them and continue to bring some kind of political coherence to their diverse demands. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Questions?
Talking about some of the causative factors that may have played a role in this, you talked about things that have been, poverty been ongoing, and others. But something I guess was sort of new, looking at, well, of course, there's been the demographic pressures. Hasn't the population like doubled since the 60s? And even with immigration, it's going up. And also, in the last couple of years, we've had speculation in commodities, in grains, in corn. And in the United States, there's been like deregulation, and Goldman Sachs and others had position limits on, especially in oil, have been removed. And we saw what happened in oil 2 years ago, and maybe happening again. But in the grains, I mean, isn't Egypt one of the largest importers? 60% of their grains imported, 40% of all their food. The prices have like doubled in the last year or whatever. Hasn't this played a role, and isn't this continuing, the high prices?
Yes, yeah, that's one of the things that was there in 2008. That was a big cause of the April 6th movement. And I should have mentioned that in conjunction with the labor protests, there were bread lines forming, bread shortages. Eventually the military had to intervene and produce more bread to help keep the price down. So yeah, that was a big problem, was the rising price of bread. Tim Mitchell has written a great article on kind of why Egypt became such a big grain importer, but it had to do with changing patterns of consumption, switching from basically consuming vegetables or livestock that don't require a lot of grain to consuming beef or other sources of meat instead. But yes, that was a big part of it. But again, we still have to ask why 2008, not 2011.
Okay.
You mentioned near the end of your talk that a lot depends on the ability of the January 25th movement to keep together the various strands of protest in the country. And we certainly know that it's a lot easier to bring down a regime than it is to build one, to create a democratic regime. What is there in Egypt that would enable people who have had little experience with democracy to hold together? And, for example, I remember in the South African context, there were just hundreds and hundreds of little groups operating all over the country for the last 10 years or so, building a community, a democratic community. Does Egypt have such a phenomenon going?
Well, I'd like to know more. I'd be interested in learning more about that. I guess the concern for me would be that sort of February 2011 becomes like November 2008 for Americans who supported Obama. That basically you have a big victory, but you didn't have a movement, and you don't have a kind of an organizational follow-through afterwards to really continue to translate that popular public presence into policy achievements. There are a lot of organizations, parties that these activists could connect to if they wanted, but it's really a question. But it's going to depend. I mean, many of the parties do not have really a national presence. I mean, they're very kind of Cairo-based or Cairo and Alexandria-based, and a lot of them do not have connections to these working-class movements. So, I mean, in a way, there's an opportunity here that wasn't really available under Mubarak's elections in terms of, having a party that could, or having a labor movement, or having like a socialist party or something like that, that could really be translating numbers into political representation. But they're going to need to do more. The kind of Cairo network is going to have to do a lot more national outreach for that to happen.
Yeah, Josh, I was struck by how you kind of very elegantly strung together these very disparate events. And when you were talking about the Khaled Said incident, it was reminding me of kind of Rodney King in Los Angeles, because in the lead up to all of this, when things began to bubble over in Tunisia, kind of the punditry reaction was, don't look there. We already know that the regime in Tunisia is brutal and they're authoritarian and they're different than everybody else. Or when the WikiLeaks documents came out, the response was, well, we already knew these regimes were corrupt. We already knew this. But I think you put your finger on something when there's this idea, and this was the connection with Rodney King, which was that obviously African Americans in Los Angeles were not surprised by the fact that the police abused them. And this was sort of a shared conception of what life was like in some of these neighborhoods in Los Angeles. But when it's captured on TV, and you can actually see for your eyes individual brutalized, what I'm trying to say, I think you put your finger on something that we can't yet, and I'm asking you if you could conceptualize this, because this is sort of where political science stops, because these are not the kind of movements that we can conceptualize and operationalize. But and obviously you weren't in Egypt. None of us were in Egypt when this was happening. But can you go a little bit further in trying to flesh out this, not emotion, but this idea when something that is shared conceptually suddenly is shown to the world, it affects kind of a collective dignity in a way that it doesn't seem to me we've yet been able to capture. But I think you described it quite well.
Yeah, well, and I will credit here, I mean, to the extent that it's elegant, I will credit my colleague at UT Austin, Tariq El Aris, who was on a panel with me the other night. He does comp lit, and he's been working on this and thinking about kind of, he's looking at like online discourse as literature, really, and thinking about how it affects people. What it does is, when you have like YouTube or Facebook and everyone can connect to it, or Al Jazeera and Rodney King, is it breaks what is normally the a chief weapon in the arsenal of state security, which is keeping people kind of isolated, in a way, shamed, vulnerable as individuals. I mean, if you've ever read the Gulag Archipelago, this idea that people just disappear and then there's no connection, it flips that dynamic upon the person who is detaining them, so that all of a sudden it's the Ministry of Interior that's being scandalized, that's being exposed, and it shines the light on them, and it makes that person, rather than just being an isolated victim who's like just in a cell alone, forgotten, it publicizes their experience. And so that's what I think is so, really a difference between repression that happened in the early 2000s with repression that happened in the 1990s. Because we get the Wa'il Abbas video on YouTube, and we get the people. Was it Ahmed Mahir who was tweeting as he was being arrested during January 25th, or back to TV for a second, Wa'il Ghanim going on and giving this interview on Dream TV after he's released. So yeah, that's what I think.
All of these things can bring about a change, a revolution, but can they bring democracy? As an historian who's studied U.S. history, we had 100 years of local democracy, very small, people just doing for themselves because England was too far away, and even if it wanted to interfere, it really couldn't. So when our revolution finally came, we had experience. Is there anything analogous to that going on in Egypt?
Well, so there's kind of democracy, and then there's really big democracy. If we talk about the conditions in Egypt, the political conditions shifting to be more like what Indonesians have after Suharto, that many people would say, well, that's a lot of democracy. That's a big change. But many
individual villages, for example, did individual villages deal with their own irrigation problems, for example, or their schools, or what goes on in the villages? Do they have student organizations of a small scale? These are things that people do for themselves, then did for themselves in colonial America, and did for themselves in South Africa, because apartheid said you can't be with the white guys doing these things. Do it yourself. Apartheid brought on their own demise in that sense. And I wonder what's going on in the neighborhoods and in the villages in Egypt that is similar to democracy.
Okay. Well, historically, under the free officers regime, at the local level, there was control by state security. That's not to say that people were not organizing themselves and experiencing civic life and engaging in it. I think that's just as present in Egypt as in Indonesia or other cases. But, I guess the question I'm thinking about is more, are they going to have a government where there would be less police brutality, where there will be more accountable executive, where they won't be living under martial law? And that's a little different than saying, is it going to be a participatory democracy at the local level? Yeah, and again, if 5 years from now, in terms of the level of security presence in people's lives, it's more like Indonesia or Chile or one of these other developing countries that we think of as a democracy, that would be a big change. But of course, those places still have problems with economic inequality and representative government.
I'm struck by the difference in the revolutions between what happened in what's happening in Libya and what happened in Egypt. Why what's happening in Libya didn't happen in Egypt, and why what happened in Egypt didn't happen in Libya? What was the differences?
Yeah, well, in that case, I mean, it's really Libya that's the outlier if we think about Tunisia, Egypt, how things have gone in Bahrain so far. So it's really, I mean, fortunately, Libya is the aberration, not the trend. And I think that has a lot to do with the attitude of the ruler to the people, in the sense that, unlike Mubarak, Gaddafi is ready to basically, wage war upon his own people to stay in power. So, I think that the Gaddafi factor looms large.
Jason, in terms of the going forward in terms of U.S. policy and democracy promotion, based on your research in the past on what are the parameters of sort of democracy promotion in D.C., what are the camps these guys break up into, and how do you see them potentially adapting to a sort of post-2011 Egypt where I suspect they're going to try and hang on to their policies in the region but change their rhetoric?
Yeah, right now there's a kind of interesting tacit alliance between some neoconservatives and then some who would be kind of on the left in the U.S. in terms of saying democracy in Egypt will be a good thing for Egyptians and for U.S. policy. It's not very often that you open the Washington Post op-ed page and see Michael Gerson and Gene Robinson in agreement. But they were, on Egypt, opposite a column that talked about how the Muslim Brothers were going to take over and we should all be worried about this. So that's something that's going on. I'm not sure how deep the commitment, of whether they're on the left or whether they're neocons, how deep their commitment will be to democracy in terms of addressing the underlying socioeconomic problems that demand attention in Egypt. And also, there's always the question of how Americans will respond after an election and an actual government is chosen, or even after the government is chosen, after the government starts going its own way. I mean, my sense of what a democratic Egypt will mean for U.S.-Egyptian relations is not that there would be a threat to the treaty or there would be a threat to U.S. preferential passage to the Suez Canal or these other elements of the strategic relationship, but that the U.S. could find itself dealing with a more assertive and independent ally, can have a more sort of vocal interlocutor on some issues, much like Washington has had with Ankara. So, and I think for some people that's actually a fear. Like they don't want Egypt to become more independent of U.S. policies the way Turkey is, even though basically Turkey and the U.S. are in agreement 90% of the time, and then they kind of compromise on the other 10%. But with Mubarak, it's been agreement 99% of the time and compromise 1%.
Could you talk a little bit about the elite politics at the end? So I still don't understand why my understanding or my reading of the news was that the military stopped supporting Mubarak, and that enabled essentially his extraction for him to leave. If that understanding is correct, why did that happen? Was there something behind the scenes with, U.S. aid to the military or some other, internal domestic negotiation? Because that doesn't seem to have been explained yet in the news accounts.
There's a lot of, how should I say, the first accounts that we've gotten, their reliability is in question. Some of them have said that Gamal Mubarak was isolating his father so that he wouldn't have a sense of the full scope of the demonstrations, and that eventually the military communicated with President Mubarak and explained just how bad they were, and then and they had a discussion, and Mubarak decided to step down. But my sense is that the military did not force him to step down, that it was really the military communicating, like, this thing continues to go on, we think you should step down. And then he said, okay. But really, the fact that he held on so long supports, regardless of the sort of Gamal Mubarak part of that, it supports the dynamic between Hosni Mubarak and the military, that it was collegial, it was not confrontational, right up to the end. And that probably for some time they would said, well, okay, if you want to stay in a little bit longer, we'll let you stay. You can stay in a little bit longer, we're not going to push you out. But then it just became too much. There was one day that's really interesting is February 10th, the Thursday, the day before his resignation is announced, because everyone was expecting he was going to step down that day. And the story that we've heard is that the military thought he was going to step down that day, that they'd all agreed. Wael Ghonim, the Google executive, has been so prominent in the January 25th movement, tweeted, "Mission accomplished," always, fateful last words, but, and people were wondering, what did he mean by mission accomplished? Because Hosni Mubarak's speech was not a resignation speech that night. But the story we have is that Gamal got to him, sort of rewrote the speech so that he could try to stand, and then it was the next day that they finally had the conversation, and he withdrew.
Now, dependent upon whether you watch CNN or Al Jazeera English, they'd say that there were either tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions in the street at this time. But nonetheless, there were roughly 80 million people still at home. And my question, I guess, is, were there means or methods that they were using other than social networking websites and the Internet to kind of gauge public opinion to see whether or not the majority really did want him to go, or is that just common knowledge?
Well, as one human rights activist put it, this was the first democratic referendum that Egypt had seen, maybe ever. There were pro-regime supporters that turned out. Their numbers were far fewer than the protesters. And, like with most instances of people participating in contentious collective action, for each one person, one would assume that they're representing a few more back home. People weren't going to bring wouldn't always bring their, grandparents out or their children and that kind of thing. So I think you're right to point out that many people, and this will be interesting, pretty crucial actually for the next government, that many people were probably just kind of neutral. But I think that in terms of people that really wanted Mubarak to stay in, and that thought, like, okay, we're going to have a better future by Mubarak staying in than going, I think those numbers dwindled rapidly, and that process was underscored by statements coming from party loyalists even saying, he should probably leave, or we should probably engage in more reforms.
I'm just asking if there's any questions. Brittany? This is one of my classes. Well, if there's no more questions, I would like to thank Professor Brownlee, but also as well, I did not mention at the beginning, this is actually part of a speaker series from the Center of Policy Studies and made possible by the generosity of Ms. Eloise Briskin. So we do want to thank them and thank the center. And we have one more speaker, Lauren McLean from the University of Indiana. And do you know what date? I apologize. I believe it's April. Yeah.
April 14th.
Thank you, April 14th. So thank you again for all attending, and let's give thanks to Professor Brownlee.
Thank you.